Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're doing something a little different and taking a look at a laptop cooling pad. I've wanted to do this for a long time because I used to use a cooling pad with a very hot Toshiba laptop and to be honest it didn't work. I mean it worked a little bit. Instead of 30 seconds my machine would overheat in 5 minutes. About a decade has passed since then, but I still look at products like this with some skepticism. That said, when Llano offered to send one of their cooling pads over for a review, I thought sure, why not? I mean it looks the part, and with so many of us using laptops on a daily basis, whether just as an everyday system or to play games, it's definitely worth seeing just what this thing can do. Now if you've ever owned anything like this, then you probably remember connecting it to the machine via USB. This beast though, well, it plugs straight into the mains. Along with the plug and pad itself we get a user manual, spare fan dust filter and USB cable. The pad itself has a large central fan, USB ports at the side and memory foam around the top. The description states support for 15 to 19 inch laptops, but a couple of my 14 inches sat atop this just fine, one of which I'm testing today. We have fold out legs on the bottom and fold out support arms on the top to help keep larger machines in place. The buttons on the front are for power and lighting because of course no peripheral these days is complete without customizable RGB. And here we have 4 different modes with 10 different lights. Of course, for those that prefer subtlety, function over flashiness, we can turn the lights off completely, and there's also a slightly cheaper non-RGB version available. The fan control dial is also here, and this lets us choose from 300 RPM all the way up to 2800, a gentle breeze if you will, compared to a strong gust. This can be increased in increments of 100, so it's not one or the other. According to Llano, the fan should be good for over 50,000 hours, so I'll update you in 5.5 years. After turning it on for the first time, I left for 5 minutes to go and make a cup of tea because I'm British of course, and it had been 5 minutes since my last, and when I came back the room actually felt cooler. I powered it on without the laptop on the top. Forget cooling my laptop, this thing is going to make an ideal AC unit in the summer. At the lowest 300 RPM setting it's about as loud as my Gigabyte gaming laptop under load, so it's definitely audible but nothing compared to the highest setting, which we'll get onto later. So this Gigabyte machine is the first one I want to test today. Underneath it has pretty decent ventilation, and this is going to be vital as to how much of a difference the Llano cooler will make. If you don't have bottom vents, maybe you're using a MacBook, then this probably won't be very effective. In reference to what I was saying earlier, here is how the laptop sounds under load. And here is what the cooling pad fan sounds like at the lowest 300 RPM setting. Very similar according to my ears. The first test I ran was a Superposition Benchmark, which will stress our GPU. Without the Llano cooler, at the 1080p Extreme preset, the RTX 3060 laptop GPU hit 66 degrees, which is still pretty reasonable. This temperature is far from concerning, but for the sake of testing, of course, let's see how the lowest 300 RPM mode changes things. This time, our temp maxed out at 59, even better. To keep things simple, I've tested the cooler at its minimum and maximum RPM, though as I said you can choose anything in between. 2800 RPM in my opinion is too loud as a constant speed. The fan is going to produce more noise than, well, probably most laptops out there, even ones that are under extreme load. In fact, it reminds me of an old blower style 2080 Ti GPU that I used to own. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly effective as is demonstrated by the further drop in GPU temp. That said, I think this mode is best used if you need to cool your machine down quickly, because turning the dial way up will visibly drop temperatures in a matter of seconds. This was apparent in my Cyberpunk 2077 test, which with the Ultra RT preset pushed both the CPU and GPU in terms of performance and heat. Just like with the Superposition Benchmark, I tested the machine without a cooler and then with the cooler at the minimum 300 RPM and maximum 2800 RPM modes. Here I recorded the changes with the CPU, GPU and GPU hotspot temps, and everything you need to know is up on screen. As expected, the more aggressive the fan mode, the cooler our processor and graphics card stayed. Now in my opinion, and when used with this Gigabyte machine, the 300 RPM mode is fine. It dropped our i5 11400H temperature well below the 90 degrees we were seeing without the cooler, and the fan didn't produce any more noise than that of the laptop itself. In fact, it was probably a tad quieter. Before moving on to our next laptop, an older Alienware, I want to talk about price. At over £100 at the time of this video on Amazon UK, this probably appeals more to those who have already spent hundreds on a gaming machine and are perhaps a little disappointed with the cooling capabilities. It's not uncommon for some to spend this sort of money on peripherals and accessories too, but I can certainly picture it underneath a modern machine as opposed to what I'm going to test next. This is the Alienware M14X I showcased in the previous video. It's older, smaller and generally cooler in operation, likely thanks to its larger frame. There's more room for the heat to disperse and more ventilation on the underside. The specs are older and weaker as well. This thing has an i5 CPU and GTX 765M graphics card, and again under load it can get quite audible. The Llano cooler, once again in the minimum 300 RPM mode, seems to emit a similar level of noise. I'm glad to see that this machine actually fits on here. The fold-out support arms won't be much use, but the memory foam has a sort of sticky texture that stops the laptop sliding down the pad. It seems to stay in place just fine without them, to be honest. First up we have the Superposition Benchmark once again, which will push our GPU to full load. Just like before, 300 RPM makes a noticeable difference, and the highest 2800 RPM mode will bring the temps down further still. It's even more unnecessary here though, as the 765M doesn't get as hot as I was anticipating. Now this thing isn't really capable of playing Cyberpunk, so I tested The Witcher 3 this time around, which is another title that is pretty hard on our hardware and will increase the thermals when the action starts to heat up. Pardon the pun. Because the CPU and GPU were cooler to begin with, the temperature drops were even more noticeable after turning the dial right round, but here are the results from the 300 and 2800 RPM tests. We don't get a hotspot reading with hardware info here, probably due to the age of the GPU. Despite this, there are still clear changes with the maximum and average readings elsewhere. Now it must have been 10, maybe 15 years since I last used a laptop cooling pad, and after being disappointed with my experience in the past, I'm glad this one seems to do what it says. For the price, I hoped that would be the case. I'm a bit of an RGB convert, I have to be honest, and it seems to be creeping more and more into my daily setup, so I think this looks good and it will suit setups with similar theming. If not, it can always be turned off. Of course, the laptops I tested today weren't operating outside of what I'd call safe and normal temps, and results will vary from model to model. Hopefully by testing a couple of my machines, my findings will prove useful. This has been a bit of a different video from the usual hardware that we focus on, but as I said before, it was a bit of a personal one. I'll never forget the day my old laptop overheated, and hopefully this beast will mean I don't have to experience it again. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.